There was a night, long before the world knew the name Smokin' Joe Frazier, when a large young man from the Deep South stepped into a ring and beat him. Not on points that anyone could argue, not in some backroom exhibition nobody remembers. He beat Joe Frazier at the United States Olympic trials, and by beating him, he earned the right to represent his country at the Tokyo Games of 1964. That young man was Buster Mathis. And here is the strange, aching truth at the center of this story. He earned the gold medal chance first. Frazier only got there because of what happened next. Today, if his name is remembered at all, it is as a footnote, a trivia answer. The heavyweight who was surprisingly nimble for his size. The man who fought Ali, who fought Frazier, who fought Jerry Quarry and George Chuvalo and Ron Lyle, and somehow slipped through the cracks of the golden age he belonged to. This is the story of how a fighter who once weighed around 245 pounds of fast, agile muscle would, years after the cheering stopped, balloon to a reported 550 pounds. It is the story of a man born in Sledge, Mississippi on June 11th, 1943, who built his life far to the north in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and who, on a September day in 1995, would be found unconscious in his own home by his wife. His final professional record reads 30 wins, 21 of them by knockout, against only 4 losses. Those are the numbers of a serious contender. So how does a man like that become one of boxing's greatest what-ifs? Before the fame, before the collapse, before the long, slow decline of his body, there was a single injury to one hand that quietly rewrote the entire history of the heavyweight division. He came into the world in Sledge, Mississippi on June 11th, 1943. To understand what that meant, you have to understand the place and the moment. This was the Deep South at the height of segregation, a world of cruel societal barriers and deeply rooted injustice, where a black child's future was fenced in before he could walk. Doors that opened easily for others stayed locked for families like his. Like so many black families of that era, the search for something better pulled them northward, part of the Great Migration that carried millions out of the rural South toward the factories and promise of the industrial North. And it was Grand Rapids, Michigan, that became Buster Mathis's adopted home. This is the emotional anchor of the entire story, the city where he would build his family, raise a son who carried his name, and decades later spend his final years. Consider the timing of his youth. He was coming of age as America moved, slowly and painfully, toward the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In those years, for a young black man, the avenues to real success were painfully narrow. But sports was one of the few open ladders. In the ring, the scoring was blunt and honest in a way the rest of the country often was not. A man either won or he didn't. And Buster Mathis was big, unusual, memorably big. Yet those who saw him move noticed something that didn't add up. For all his size, he was quick, light on his feet, almost graceful. By his late teens, that combination of bulk and speed carried him into amateur boxing. And it pointed him, without warning, straight toward a collision with another hungry young heavyweight named Joe Frazier. Buster Mathis had a genuinely strong amateur career as a heavyweight. He was a national caliber fighter, a young man whose blend of size and surprising agility made him a nightmare for opponents who expected a slow, plodding big man, and instead found themselves chasing a moving target. And then came the moment that should have defined him. The moment that, in a fairer world, would have made him famous. At the United States Olympic trials leading up to the 1964 Tokyo Games, Buster Mathis defeated Joe Frazier. He won the berth. He earned the right to wear his country's colors as a heavyweight in the Olympics. On that day, in that ring, the man who would one day be crowned a legend was the runner-up. Buster Mathis was the winner. Think about what a 1964 Olympic gold medal could mean for a young black heavyweight. National fame, instant credibility, enormous leverage when the professional promoters came calling. In an era when black athletes had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, an Olympic gold was a launch pad, a golden ticket to everything the sport had to offer. And Buster Mathis had just fought his way to the front of that line. For one shining stretch, the future belonged to him. He was the man going to Tokyo. He was the one the country would watch. Joe Frazier, on that day, was simply the fighter who had come up short. Then came the injury, a hand that betrayed him at the worst possible moment, and with it, a door that swung wide open for the very man he had just beaten. It was an injury to his hand. That is the pivot on which two entire legacies turned. The hand injury forced Buster Mathis to withdraw from the Tokyo Olympics he had rightfully earned. And boxing, indifferent as ever, needed a replacement. The man who stepped into that spot was Joe Frazier, the fighter Mathis had beaten to get there in the first place. Frazier went to Tokyo. Frazier won the gold medal. And Frazier came home with the launch pad that should have been Buster Mathis's. Stop and sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most consequential what-ifs in the entire history of the heavyweight division. Joe Frazier would go on to become an all-time great, a world champion, one half of one of the most famous rivalries the sport has ever known. And the first meaningful chapter of that legend, Olympic gold, only happened because another man's hand gave out at exactly the wrong time. We will never truly know what a healthy Buster Mathis in Tokyo might have become. Would he have carried gold into a professional career and been the one billed as boxing's next great heavyweight? Would the entire arc of the division have bent a different way? These are questions without answers. What we do know is the cold shape of the outcome. The prize he had earned went to the man he had defeated, and history filed Buster Mathis away as the answer to a trivia question. There is no need to invent what that did to him inside, but no fighter forgets a thing like that. Denied the Olympic stage, Buster Mathis was left with only one path forward. He would prove himself the hard way, one professional knockout at a time, starting in June of 1965. In June of 1965, Buster Mathis turned professional, and he announced himself the way a serious heavyweight is supposed to, with a second-round knockout of a fighter named Bob Maynard. No ceremony, no Olympic fanfare, just a big man walking into the paid ranks and taking care of business. And then he kept winning. After that debut, Mathis reeled off 22 straight victories, building an unbeaten record, and brick by brick, the profile of a legitimate championship contender. In January of 1966, he stopped the rugged Chuck Wepner in the third round at Madison Square Garden, the most famous fight building in the world. For a fighter still climbing, a stoppage win under those lights was a statement. What made him such a puzzle for opponents was the contradiction in his body. Here was a hulking figure who often fought at around 245 pounds, and yet the word that followed him was nimble, amazingly nimble. He had genuine boxing skill, respected power, and combinations that came fast and landed accurately. Big men were supposed to be slow. Buster Mathis was not. He could outmove fighters who thought they'd simply wait him out, and he could hurt the ones who got careless. Fight after fight, the record stayed clean. The wins piled up. The contender's resume grew heavier and more convincing. Buster Mathis was no longer the man who missed the Olympics. He was an undefeated heavyweight knocking on the door of a world title. But that door existed at all only because of one of the most explosive political decisions in the history of American sports. A decision that had nothing to do with Buster Mathis and everything to do with the most famous heavyweight alive. To understand the opportunity that fell into Buster Mathis's lap, you first have to understand the earthquake that created it. In 1967, the most famous heavyweight alive, Muhammad Ali, refused to step forward for military induction during the Vietnam War. It was a stand rooted in religious conviction and open opposition to the war, and the boxing establishment answered swiftly and coldly. Ali was stripped of his heavyweight championship. Just like that, the crown that had sat on the head of the most talked-about athlete on the planet was suddenly sitting on no one at all. And that vacancy changed everything for the fighters left behind. The New York State Athletic Commission recognized its own version of the world heavyweight title, and now it needed a champion. Buster Mathis, still undefeated, still climbing, still carrying that peculiar blend of size and speed, had built exactly the kind of record that qualified a man for a shot at an open throne. Think about the strange machinery of it all. A young black fighter from Grand Rapids was being handed a championship opportunity, not because the sport had finally decided to reward him, but because another black man had dared to defy the United States government and paid for it with his title. The whole heavyweight division had been rearranged by one man's refusal to march, and the athletes scrambling to fill that empty space became, whether they wanted to or not, characters in a national drama about race, war, faith, and power. For Mathis, none of that political weight mattered inside the ropes. What mattered was that the door to a world title had swung open. All he had to do was walk through it. But standing on the other side, waiting once again, was the one fighter who had shadowed him since that Olympic trials night in 1964, Joe Frazier. And this time, the stage would be the grandest in the entire sport. On the 4th of March, 1968, Buster Mathis walked into Madison Square Garden to fight for a version of the World Heavyweight Championship. Across the ring stood Smokin' Joe Frazier, the same man he had beaten as an amateur, the same man who had taken his Olympic place, the same man whose gold medal had been built on Mathis's misfortune. 4 years of history had led both of them to this single night, and now the debt would be settled in front of the world. For a while, the fight told the old story, the big, nimble contender using his movement, his skill, his surprising quickness. But Frazier was a different animal now, relentless, punishing, the kind of fighter who walked through pressure and gave it back double. Round by round, the pace and the power began to tilt, and in the 11th round, it ended. The referee stepped in and stopped the bout at 2 minutes and 33 seconds of the 11th. Frazier had won. Frazier was champion. Sit with the cruelty of the symmetry. The very victory that had once sent Buster Mathis toward the Olympics, his triumph over Frazier, was now answered on the biggest professional stage of his life. In the amateurs, Mathis had been the winner, and Frazier the runner-up. Now the roles had flipped, permanently, under the brightest lights the sport could offer. The man he had beaten had become a world champion by beating him back. There is a particular kind of heartbreak reserved for fighters who lose the one fight they spent their whole lives preparing for. Buster Mathis had chased this crown, earned his shot, and come up short against the one rival who seemed destined to haunt every chapter of his story. It would have been easy to imagine that this was the end of him. But it wasn't. Not yet. Because the fights that followed would reveal something even more painful than a loss to a great champion, a quiet, recurring pattern of near misses. And one of those fights was a bout Buster Mathis was actually favored to win. Losing a championship to a fighter as great as Joe Frazier is no disgrace. Plenty of good men did. But what happened next in Buster Mathis's career is harder to explain, and in some ways, sadder. Because the story that began to take shape wasn't one of a man beaten by greatness. It was the story of a man who kept arriving at the decisive moment and coming up just short. He kept fighting. He outpointed the tough, granite-chinned veteran George Chuvalo, a genuinely respected name, a man almost nobody could knock down. That was a real win over a real fighter, the kind of result that should have propelled Mathis back toward the top. But then came the bout against Jerry Quarry, and here is the detail that stings. Mathis was favored. The odds makers, the insiders, the people who watched fighters for a living believed he would win. And he lost on points. That's the pattern. Not blowouts, not embarrassments. Close, agonizing, winnable fights that slipped away at exactly the wrong time. For a fighter with his gifts, the size, the speed, the accurate hands, the respected power, it was a maddening kind of career. Everything was there except the finish. The talent kept promising more than the results delivered. After the Quarry defeat in 1969, Buster Mathis walked away. He retired, and you can understand why. He was a supremely capable heavyweight who had beaten fine opponents and shared the ring with the best of his era. Yet the biggest thresholds kept turning him back. When a man loses a fight he was supposed to win, something inside him has to wonder how many more chances the sport will offer. But retirement, as it so often does with fighters, did not hold. The pull of the ring, the money, the pride, the unfinished business proved stronger than the decision to leave. And when Buster Mathis came back, waiting for him in Houston was the one man whose absence had shaped his entire career. Muhammad Ali had returned from exile, and he wanted Mathis in front of him. By 1971, the world had shifted again. Muhammad Ali had been reinstated, was fighting once more, and was on the long road back to reclaiming everything that had been taken from him. And on the 17th of November, 1971, at the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, Buster Mathis stepped out of retirement to face him. With the WBC North American Boxing Federation heavyweight belt on the line. For a returning fighter, it was an enormous stage against an almost impossible opponent. Ali was Ali, faster, sharper, and more brilliant than perhaps any heavyweight had a right to be. Over 12 rounds, he won a clear decision. On the surface, it was a straightforward result, the great Ali handling a game but overmatched contender. But there was a wrinkle, and it's one that has followed this fight through the decades. In the reporting of the time, Ali drew criticism for not putting Mathis away in the closing rounds, for seeming to some observers to ease off when he might have finished the job. Now, we have to be careful here. What was in Ali's mind that night is something no headline can prove. It was framed in the boxing press of that era as a curious act of restraint, and it should be understood as the impression of writers watching from ringside, not as some confirmed confession of intent. Still, The question lingers, and it's a haunting one. Was Buster Mathis simply outclassed by an all-time great? Or did that reported hesitation say something quieter and sadder? That even in a losing effort, Mathis was seen as a big, likable, nimble man who didn't need to be destroyed. Either way, the outcome was the same. Another marquee night, another loss. Another belt that belonged to someone else. The Olympic dream had gone to Frazier. The world title had gone to Frazier. And now, this belt stayed with Ali. There was only one fight left in him, and unlike the close decisions and the respectful losses that had come before, this ending would be sudden and brutal. The kind that closes a ring door and never lets it open again. Every fighter's career ends. Very few get to choose how. For Buster Mathis, the end came in September of 1972 against a hard-hitting heavyweight named Ron Lyle, and it came fast. The most detailed records, drawn from the sport's fight archives, place the finish in the second round, though a few accounts have described it as 3 rounds, and some place it in August rather than September. What isn't in dispute is the shape of it. Lyle knocked him out. And after that night, Buster Mathis never fought professionally again. There is something merciless about ending that way. The near misses, the close decisions, the 12 competitive rounds with Ali, those had been the story of a man who could hang with anyone. But a swift knockout is a different message entirely. It's the sport telling a fighter, in the bluntest language it has, that the time is over. And so the ledger closed. When you add it all up, Buster Mathis finished with 30 wins, 21 of them by knockout, against just 4 losses. Look closely at that record, and you see the strange tragedy of it. He had beaten George Chuvalo. He had stopped Chuck Wepner at Madison Square Garden. He had shared the ring with Muhammad Ali, with Joe Frazier, with Jerry Quarry, with Ron Lyle, a murderer's row of the golden age of heavyweights. Almost every great name of his era passed through his story. And yet, he never wore a world championship belt that history fully recognized. 4 losses, and every one of them, it seems, arrived at the exact moment a title or a legacy was on the line. He walked away for the final time at just 29 years old. Young by most measures, young enough to have decades of life still ahead. But a fighter's body keeps a private accounting that the record book never shows. The punches absorbed, the weight fought off, the toll of a hard trade practiced against the very best. Buster Mathis left the ring carrying all of it. What no one could have predicted was that the hardest fight of his life would begin only after the boxing was over. Out of the spotlight, away from the crowds, the man who had once been amazingly nimble at 245 pounds was about to face an opponent he could not outmove, outbox, or outpunch. His own body. When the fighting stopped, the noise stopped with it. There were no more sold-out arenas, no more championship stakes, no more sports writers filling their columns with his name. There was only the ordinary work of building an ordinary life. And for a former heavyweight contender, that adjustment can be one of the loneliest fights of all. By the time a 1980 feature in Sports Illustrated went looking for the men who had once shared a ring with Muhammad Ali, it found Buster Mathis far from the spotlight. The magazine reported that he had gone to work in the trucking business. Sit with that image for a moment. A man who had traded punches with the greatest heavyweights of a legendary era, who had beaten George Chuvalo, stopped Chuck Wepner under the lights of the world's most famous arena, and gone 12 rounds with Ali himself, was now earning his living behind the wheel, hauling freight down American highways, anonymous to the drivers passing him in the next lane. There was no shame in honest work, but there was a particular ache in watching a once celebrated athlete fade into the everyday. No title had ever been his to keep. No Olympic gold hung in his home. The gifts that had made him extraordinary in the ring meant little on a loading dock, and the roar that had once followed his name had gone silent. The available record of his later years is careful and incomplete. What can be said honestly is that reports and accounts describe those years as marked by serious illness and real hardship. The finer details of his finances remain unverified, and this story will not claim more than the record can support. But the broad shape is clear enough. The descent from contender to civilian was not a gentle one. And as those quiet years stretched on, something began to change in the very body that had once defied every expectation. The nimble giant was starting to grow in a way that no diet, no trainer, and no comeback could ever undo. In his prime, his size had been part of the wonder. He carried well over 260 pounds at his heaviest fighting nights, yet moved like a fighter 40 pounds lighter. That contradiction had defined him, but the same frame that had once been an asset became in retirement the stage for a slow and devastating transformation. Reports describe how, after he left boxing, his weight climbed to as much as 550 pounds. Read that number again, more than double what he had weighed as a contender. It is a figure so extreme that it tells its own story without a single word of embellishment. A body expanding far beyond anything the ring had ever asked of it. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to reduce that to a simple failure of will. Think instead about what had been taken from him. The Olympic dream, lost to a single injured hand. The championship, lost to the one rival who seemed to haunt every chapter of his life. A career full of near misses and respectful defeats, followed by a sudden knockout that closed the door for good. A man who loses everything the world once promised him is left unmoored, and the physical consequences of those years would come to speak for themselves. And speak they did. Roughly 5 years before the end, doctors diagnosed him with high blood pressure and with diabetes, the kind of conditions that do not announce themselves loudly at first, but that grind a body down over time. Then came the strokes, 2 of them. They robbed him of control on his left side and left this once amazingly agile athlete leaning on a walker just across a room. The fighter who had danced around bigger, slower men could now barely move without help. But the cruelest blow was still ahead. In 1993, the organ at the very center of him faltered, and doctors were forced to place a device inside his chest simply to keep his heart beating. The medical record of his final years reads like a relentless downhill slide. Roughly 3 years before his passing, his kidneys failed, adding yet another treatment, another machine, another reminder of how much the body he once ruled had turned against him. And after that heart attack in 1993, the pacemaker went in, a small mechanical guardian standing watch over a heart that could no longer be trusted on its own. Most men, faced with that cascade of suffering, would have been consumed by fear. But by every account of those who loved him, Buster Mathis met his mortality with a striking calm. His wife, Joan Mathis, would later remember it plainly. He always said, she recalled, that he wasn't afraid of dying. he had come so close to passing so many times. She spoke of how he understood passing from a biblical point of view, that he understood the Bible, in her words, more than anyone ever realized. This was a fighter who had made peace with the ending long before it arrived. That peace shaped the conversations inside his home. His son, Buster Mathis Jr., remembered that his father's failing health had made passing a recurring subject between them. Not something whispered and feared, but something spoken about openly, father to son. And in one of those talks came an instruction the younger man would carry forever. "When I die," his father told him, "just go on. But nothing changes. Keep living. Keep fighting. Do not let my ending become yours." It was the wisdom of a man who had already survived 100 hard nights and understood that grief, like a great opponent, must be answered with movement rather than surrender. Then, on the 6th of September, 1995, in the Grand Rapids home where he had built his entire life, those quiet conversations stopped being hypothetical. On that day, his wife walked in and found him unconscious. It happened at home, in the place that had anchored him through everything. Joan Mathis found her husband unconscious, and in the frantic minutes that followed, family members and emergency workers did everything they could to bring him back. He was rushed to Butterworth Hospital in Grand Rapids. But a hospital spokeswoman would later say that he had arrived in full cardiac arrest. The heart that a device had been fighting to preserve for 2 years had finally, completely given out. Buster Mathis Sr. was pronounced gone. There is a small, strange footnote to his passing that is worth pausing on. Several wire reports of the day listed his age as 51. Yet his own dates tell a different story. He was born on the 11th of June, 1943, and he passed away on the 6th of September, 1995. Do the simple arithmetic, and the answer is clear. He was 52 years old. It is a tiny discrepancy, the kind that slips into obituaries written on deadline. But in a life so defined by being just slightly overlooked, by having his true story shaved down to a footnote, there is something quietly fitting and quietly sad about even his final age being reported a year short. 52 years. That was all. A man who had once been young enough to walk away from the sport at 29, now gone barely 2 decades later, his body worn out far ahead of its time. And then there was the timing, the detail that turned a private tragedy into something almost unbearable. His passing came less than 2 months before his son, Buster Mathis Jr., was scheduled to step into the ring against one of the most feared men the sport had ever produced, the former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. The father had tried, without success, to steer his boy away from boxing. Now that boy would have to fight the fight of his life without his father in his corner, carrying his name, his blood, and his final words. Grief, for most people, arrives with the mercy of quiet time to absorb it. Buster Mathis Jr. was granted no such mercy. His father was gone, and on the calendar loomed a date that could not move, a bout in Las Vegas against Mike Tyson, then perhaps the most intimidating figure in all of boxing. And the young man made his choice clear. His father's passing, he said, would not change the plan. The fight would go on. How could it not? He had been raised on those words. When I die, just go on, but nothing changes. To pull out would have been to betray the very lesson his father had spent his final years teaching him. So the son stepped forward into the same brutal trade that had made and then broken his father. carrying a name that history had never fully honored. Those who knew the elder Mathis remembered a man far larger than his record. His son described him as a master of persuasion, a natural teacher who could find the thing inside a person that motivated them toward doing right. It did not matter, the younger man said, whether a fighter was black, white, Puerto Rican, or Chinese. His father would teach them, and he would take them to a higher level. That is not the memory of a mere trivia answer or a footnote in someone else's legend. That is the memory of a man who lifted the people around him. And so we are left with the true measure of Buster Mathis. Not the crown he never wore, not the Olympic gold that a single injured hand carried away to another man, not even the 550 pounds, or the strokes, or the failing heart. What remains is the fuller portrait, a fighter of rare, improbable grace, who shared the ring with every great heavyweight of a golden age. A man of deep faith who faced his ending without fear, and a father whose final instruction became his son's marching orders. History almost forgot him, but the men he taught did not. His family did not. And now, perhaps, neither will you. Because the fighter who was always just one step from the crown left behind something no belt could ever measure. A name, passed forward, and a lesson that outlived him. When I die, he said, just go on. And so his story does.